Great close for you here. Really getting to think about opportunities and systems and the future. Like, what have we got that's undiscovered? What are the ways we can capture it? What are the ways we can think and use kind of the collective intelligence of the humans in the room that understand the complex systems in the world, capture the things that we need? And one of the ways that we've tried to do this in New Haven is actually creating a spot where we can capture and collect and support and enhance the lives of all the humans who are coming out of Yale. That's Climate Haven. It's the Climate Tech Incubator and Accelerator that we've set up in New Haven. Justine Lee is the board chair of that, and a fantastic human and resource. She's going to be our moderator for the conversation today. I should also note that we had a conversation on space earlier. Justine leaned over to me and said, my dad was actually the person who wrote some of the initial regulation on space. So if you are interested in learning more about kind of like that space place, she's also got another facet to be able to offer there, but I think that just shows the kind of like depth and integration of people in the Yale network of all the ways that they're engaged and their families and communities are. So let's get into this. This should be a lot of fun. Justine, over to you.
Thank you. I don't know. I thought that space conversation was really interesting. I know water's hot right now, but everybody left kind of wanting to be a founder in space. But yeah, water is hot, and I'm excited about this panel today. So as Stu mentioned, Climate Haven, we are an incubator for founders in the physical economy, and we have a very active, robust water innovation hub, which many of the folks in the room are engaged with. In fact, I think there was a water dinner last night at Maury's that I apparently didn't get invited to, but was a lot of fun. So we're going to do a take two on that later. And we wanted to focus this panel within water on industrial reuse. And the reason for that, is that if you think about the industries that are really defining the next wave of growth, AI, critical minerals, advanced manufacturing, they're all, some of the most water-intensive industries on Earth, and often cited in some of the most water-stressed regions in the country. And at the same time, industrial wastewater, which has historically been, a liability for disposal and management and discharge, is being rethought as a resource. So that's the topic that we wanted to get into here. And I think that reframing really changes the economics, the business model, and the investment case. So for that reason, we've gathered this panel, exactly the right people to talk about that, from industry, investing, and the operator side, and want to really get a few layers deeper and talk about some of the most interesting and topical questions. So let me introduce the panel briefly so that we can get to the questions. We have Michael Stoltz, Mike, from Xylem. He is a water tech leader. Xylem is, as many of you know, a partner to Climate Haven. They're an $8.6 billion water tech company that sells treatment systems, monitoring, and infrastructure solutions to industrial and municipal customers worldwide. Matt is co-founder and former CEO of Cambrian Innovation, an MIT spin-out that has pioneered systems that transform industrial wastewater into reusable water and recoverable energy. So he's accomplished exactly what we're talking about here. And Clayton, an investor at Emerald Technology Ventures, which is a Zurich-based venture capital firm with 1.4 billion assets under management that invests across industrial and climate technologies. Emerald has a dedicated water practice and is currently deploying out of their second standalone fund, Global Water Fund, which is backed by LPs in the industry, including Ecolab, Oxy, Veralto, Grundos, Skyon Water, and Temasek. And prior to his investing career, Clayton was also an active practitioner in the water tech field. So we've really got some expertise on this panel that I want to tap into. So with that, because Climate Haven has a founder-first mentality, we're going to start with Matt, the founder, on the panel. And I'd love to hear more about the evolution of Cambrian from an MIT spin-out to a water-as-a-service infrastructure business.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll give you a little bit. I'm former CEO of Cambrian, so I'll give you a high-level trajectory, and then I'll go into Cambrian a little more detail. I come from actually an aerospace background, so maybe I'll get back to talking about space at some point if you guys have a couple questions about that later. But I did a PhD at MIT and then started Cambrian in 2011, spun out of MIT, ran it for about 14 years, which went by faster than I would have thought, but it took a while to get the company sort of scaled in the market selling. Sold the company in 2023 to a private equity firm out of Austin that's a real asset infrastructure investor, and stayed on for a couple of years and stepped off this past September. So kind of saw it all from the initial conception all the way to industrial sales operations. We have plants across the country, Mexico, Asia. And through that process, the way I've talked to our team about it is, folks who came on later, is that there really was kind of three companies within that company. There was a couple big pivots along the way, as there almost always is when you're doing innovation, particularly in these kinds of infrastructure industries. But in the beginning, we were focused on really commercializing the technology, the core product, which was a system to treat water and generate power. Initially, we could generate methane, hydrogen, electricity, various outputs. And that was fascinating as a technology. We raised grant money, we raised venture capital, we raised family office money, and got that product in the market. And then we started selling it as an industrial product. We picked the industrial market as the entry point, specifically craft breweries in Napa and Sonoma. And I like to say you got to pick your entry markets carefully because you end up spending a lot of time in that. And we ended up being pretty happy about what we chose. But we did broaden out. After getting it in the market, we went from sort of treatment and energy generation and realized along the way that really the customers care about the output, not the tech, right? And in terms of the output, water reuse and sort of water as a value add, what was important to a lot of the folks we talked about. So we ended up expanding the offering, acquiring a business called Basswood that helped us go sort of full suite from high strength wastewater all the way to potable quality water. And we had sort of multiple products, and we're still selling industrial direct equipment sales. And the last sort of pivot, the last company was around, let's say 2017, 2018. We switched it from being an equipment provider to being a service business. And for those of you familiar with this, it happened in the solar market as well with the power purchase agreements, where a lot of companies generated a lot of value by selling electricity and not selling the panels. And we were coming across the same thing, and we can get into it in a little more detail later if you have questions. But we effectively decided we're just going to sell water and power. And we're going to install the systems in the industrial market, pay for them ourselves, and then get paid back off the revenue stream that we were generating. And that ended up working extremely well, particularly with the customers that we were talking to. We built up a really nice pipeline. So along the way, we raised about $100 million before we sold it. A lot of that was in project finance and off-balance sheet private equity, some in equity, some in grants. And then after we sold it, we had another, about $350 million committed to the growth of the company. And so excited to see where they're going to go from here. But that's sort of the high level.
Thank you. And Mike, Xylem is a massive water tech company, but you introduced yourself as an oil and gas guy. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so I got my start with Xylem in 2017, and back then we were actually just getting into the reuse of produced water for fracking. And at that time, there was a bit of an economic driver where the cost of fresh water was rising so much, but not every company really wanted to do it. But as time has marched on, it's turned out that between things like induced seismicity and zombie wells and other regulatory aspects.
And talk about zombie wells.
Yeah, absolutely. Recycling produced water went from being something that was kind of a nice to have, now it's a must have. So now on top of that, the big thing is looking at, okay, how do we take this water and commercialize it even more? Can we do mineral extraction? Can we use it for data centers? All those hot topics that we've been talking about here really is all over the Permian Basin and other shales as well, even down in Argentina and across the world. So while I was in all industrial wastewater, the way things have gone in oil and gas, it's just naturally where I've gone to and gravitated to, and I get along really well with those West Texas boys, so it all works out.
Great. And Clayton, Emerald Ventures also invest broadly in climate and technology, but your focus is and has been water. What stage do you guys invest in? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, and everyone hear me? Good. Yeah. Okay. And thanks for the invite. Great to be here. So, as Justine mentioned, the firm's been around for 25, 26 years, global fund, headquartered in Zurich, offices in Singapore and Toronto, investing in only climate. And so Water is a key theme of ours. We're on our second water fund, our first dedicated water fund. We actually wrapped up the investment period last year. It was a $100 million vehicle invested in 15 companies globally. We've recently stood up our second dedicated water fund, which I am solely focused on. So the stage of companies that we're looking at, I find Series A, Series B in water doesn't typically mean a lot. We're looking at companies with commercial revenues somewhere between 1 and 5, 1 and 10 million. We want that tech to be de-risked out of the lab, ideally with a pilot or completed pilot going into some sort of full-scale opportunity. But that really depends on if it's equipment, deep tech. We're going to talk about that a lot today, right? I mean, the project financing bit, where they are commercially, that needs to be a little more secure than, say, if you're doing a software play. And so that's the stage that we're looking at, but it is just one of many, many topics that we look at with the company. I mean, good tech doesn't always win. So it's, do the founders, does the team, do they understand their go-to-market, the customer pain points, what their focus looks like? The team is huge. An individual on the VC panel this morning mentioned it's a marriage, right? You get invested by a VC or another group, you're getting married for a number of years. And so I always, excuse my language, but we say, don't invest in assholes. Because it just doesn't work. We're going to be on their board. It's going to be 5 to 10 years of working closely together. And I say the same thing to all the companies that we're even talking to. If you think I'm an asshole, don't take money from me because I'm going to be on your board, and it's not going to go well. So stage is important, but everything else surrounding the company as it drives innovation and drives scale is equally as important to us.
Maybe we'll stay with you for a second. Help me set the stage. Historically, why has adoption of some of this technology been slow? What's going on the demand side? How does the pricing of water play into that?
So Matt mentioned 14 years.
12 to the sale.
12 to the sale. So a gentleman named Paul O'Callaghan, he founded Blue Tech Research, and he wrote a book. He did his PhD thesis on a topic and then wrote a book on it, the time it takes water tech to scale. And it's somewhere between 10 and 15 years, and it has been like that historically, whether or not you're focused on utility or industry. From the industrial perspective, because that's why we're here, water's been cheap. I mean, we talked about, right, the water rates are going up. It's still relatively, to a big oil and gas major or mining company, it's a drop in the bucket. Discharge rates, shipping or sending things down the sewer are equally inexpensive for these big industries. So it has been more of a afterthought. It's a minor cost for them, and they haven't had to focus on reuse. I mean, in addition, we're now in a stage of climate change, right? So water scarcity is also starting to drive this. So yeah, water has been relatively cheap. Wastewater for a lot of industries historically has been looked at as a nuisance, I would say. I mean, back in the day when I was with GE, I spent a lot of time in Fort McMurray on some of these oil and gas sites north of Fort McMurray, and there's massive tailings ponds of oil and gas water, and we were there trying to help solve that, treat it, discharge it, and we were a pain. We were a nuisance on site because they just didn't care because it wasn't helping the company make money. But now that's starting to change, and that's the point of this panel. We're going to dive into that.
Yeah. So maybe, Mike, you could help tease some of that out. Like, let's focus in on produced water. And explain, why there's so much interest now in potential reuse, and maybe cover some of the basics in terms of like the volume of produced water.
Yeah, and just touch on that too real quick. Any industrial water, for example, there's a plant in Macon, Georgia right now where the municipality has said, hey, we're only going to give you 7 million gallons a day. They need 9 million gallons a day. So they are trying to figure out how to, recycle that extra 2 million gallons out of their plant so that they don't get cut off by the municipality. And it's ironic because you are seeing the same thing in, essentially the Permian Basin, where we're pulling out massive amounts of water. Every barrel of oil that comes up, 4 barrels of water come with it. So it's almost the byproduct, right? Oil. Water is what you're bringing up. And what we did for the past, 70 plus years with this water, it's nasty stuff. I mean, you got chlorides up to 400,000 parts per million. You're bringing up norm, all kinds of just really gross stuff. So they sent it down hole. And what they've been doing year in and year out is pumping this out at really high pressures. And what's happening with that water, though, like electricity, it takes that path of least resistance. It's coming back to the surface. And when it comes back to the surface, it can be sour, it can be terrible, it causes just so much money worth of damage in infrastructure. And then when you add the induced seismicity on top of that, so Texas and New Mexico both created special seismic response zones, where if they got earthquakes over a 5.0 magnitude, I believe it was, they would actually limit the amount of water that companies could put back down hole. And that happened. The first time it happened after they created these zones, everybody was kind of like waiting to see, like, are they actually going to follow through with this? Well, then a month later, they got another 5.4. And then they did. New Mexico rolled it back completely. So New Mexico is shipping water across the border to Texas so that it can be disposed of. So finding a use for that water now, it is absolutely a necessity.
So let's double click on that just a second to make sure everybody got the point, because the water, like, there's both a regulatory issue that they've capped the amount of water you can inject, but there's also just nowhere to put it, as I understand it.
That's correct.
And what's happening to the water that they are injecting, and how is that leading to these zombie wells and earthquakes that we're hearing about?
Yeah, so essentially, there's a couple of theories, because when you take water and you re-inject it back down 5 to 10,000 foot in the ground, you don't actually know where it's going or what it's doing, right? So you can have these giant salt domes that you're going into that you're causing to crack, which can cause the earthquakes. Your bottom hole pressure could just be going just way up and essentially just causing a shift in the earth, right? And when you look at the zombie wells, it's the same thing. What happens is that water starts to creep back towards the surface. And in the meantime, you think you're disposing into a single well, but in reality, that could be connecting over to another well. And what happens is you keep pumping down, well, now you're overpressurizing this well over here. And then you're going into old well casings, and you're popping back up to the surface. There's a lady named Laura Capper, and I couldn't recommend enough following her on LinkedIn. She does all these great studies on bottom hole pressures, wells, and where the earthquakes are, for example. And I mean, correlation is not always causation, but in this case, it's causation. And so, sorry, it's just there. So, you have all that out there. And so at the same time, though, industries change. West Texas is going drier, right? They used to have natural prairie lands, better grass, a lot of cattle. Ranches are going out. We did a field trip to a ranch that's run out of water last year. So now you do have opportunities for this produced water that you could use. And once again, data centers, everybody wants to use it for data centers. Our systems load at 50% capacity, we recycle 3.2 billion gallons of produced water every single day. So if you think about taking that, and we talk about the water problem with data centers like Meta in Mansfield, Georgia, we can solve that problem, right? And so that's where the commercialization of this produced water is really becoming a massive topic.
So Clayton, there's the economic, incentive for the companies to figure out a different solution to injection, and there's demand for the clean water. Do you think that alone would change the way in which the new technology is getting adopted, or does the prospect of critical mineral recovery and other revenue accelerate it, or is it definitively a game changer for it?
It's a detailed question. Where to begin? The drivers are enough, in my opinion at least, for treatment and beneficial reuse. Correct me if I'm wrong, the reuse that's happening today, especially in the Permian Basin, is reuse back into oil field activities. So you can have correct? So it's not minor by any means, but there's treatment, you reuse it back into fracking and other well applications. The gap here is regulatory permitting. The technology exists to take produced water and treat it down to a quality low enough, clean enough that you can use it in farming irrigation, in data centers, in going into semi-fab plants. But the regulatory permitting piece is not there. And there's also a public perception, right? Pulling produced water, no matter how well you clean it, it's just like wastewater potable reuse in California. Everybody just finds that a little gross, right? Getting it that clean and using it back in. So public perception challenge and permitting challenge, but the tech and the drivers are clearly there with how much water is available and how much is going to be needed in data centers, semis, when you're getting into Texas and Arizona, where they're already water scarce, and in 5-10 years, it's only going to get worse and worse and worse. So there's a few hurdles that need to overcome for that, the technologies and the companies we're looking at to be able to scale, but there's still a lot of hurdles to overcome. It's just a question of time from my perspective.
And is I think one of your LPs, Occidental, or Oxy, is pursuing lithium extraction from produced water. Does that signal that they're genuinely, rethinking how the value of produced water?
I think many different industries in North America and Europe are genuinely looking at onshoring critical mineral supply. So whether or not that comes from other sources or produced water, I mean, mining as an example, right? There's a lot of tailings ponds that are known to have enough copper and other critical minerals that can get pulled out. It's just the economics and the technology in the TRL stage. So it's genuine. Everyone is looking at it. It's just now, I think, going to be a question of time and complexity. I mean, Mike mentioned produced water it's ugly. It's extremely complex, and there's new analytical chemistry techniques coming out today to really understand the concentration of lithium, concentration of copper, other critical minerals, because techniques we have today just simply aren't able to cut it and say definitively, yes, there's enough concentration in here that it's going to be economical to pull out and reuse. And so, I mean, it's an early hurdle, just figuring out exactly what's in the produced water to be able to pull it out. It's not meaning to sound so pessimistic. I think it's going to happen. It's just now a question of time.
So it is going to happen. And the reason I'm lingering on that topic is that together with Xylem, Climate Haven issued its latest innovation challenge, which is in critical minerals. So I think, when I think big picture about like the how advanced the technology is, this is a really interesting area to be building in right now. And that's, the kind of thing that this audience and this university does extremely well. And it's a place that we think there's so much opportunity. I don't know, Mike, if you have more to elaborate on that.
I was just going to add a couple things. The big question you always get out there, right, is how clean is clean enough to what you're saying. And you can't blame the general public. If you look at what's in this water, there's a lot of stuff in there. Governor Abbott did finally sign the bill that's allowing for reuse. So that regulatory hurdle has been gotten over, but the question still remains, how clean is clean enough? Because TCEQ, nobody else has anything published to say, like, this is actually where you have to clean this water to. So that's kind of an unknown, and when there's unknowns in that space, it makes it really hard for people to want to invest into it, right? And so that's kind of one of the hurdles there. But on to the critical mineral recovery, lithium's definitely a hot topic, but what people don't realize is there are things, iodine is one of the biggest ones out there, barium, bromium. There's so many other minerals that come up in this water that really could be valuable with good technology to pull it out. So I completely agree that it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when.
So, Matt, this idea of, turning a disposal, a byproduct, a liability into a revenue stream is, the premise of all of that. And I think Cambrian has very much illustrated that. What did it take to change the perspective of your customer? And what they had historically always just wanted to get rid of is not their focus. Everyone teaches you, as a founder and you're building a company, just focus on your thing and don't get distracted. Did they see the wastewater as a distraction, or how did you change that thinking?
Yeah, well, fundamentally, companies don't want to deal with their wastewater. I mean, they're gonna spend the money if they have to, and if they don't have to, they're gonna avoid it. I would kind of differentiate between the initial sales that we did and the later sales that we did. Initially, it's very much, what's been called an evangelical sale, and there you're kind of literally painting the vision for your customers of, look, you're calling this pollution, you're calling it a liability. What if it was a resource? Let us, with our new technology, with our new approach, show you how that could be a possibility. And that approach is really getting somebody in, an industrial company to see that as a vision that they can get behind and that they can support. Once you get into sort of, across the so-called chasm to the mainstream customers, there's really only one thing that matters, and that's how much is this going to cost me. And how much is it going to save me, and is it reliable? I guess that's three things. But what does it cost, and is it reliable? And so for that, our whole reason for doing energy extraction and water reuse was really to drive down the cost of of water in general. And so if you look at the cost of operating a plant, you've got a portion up front in the capital and you've got a whole lot of it in the operations. And if you can shave something off the operations by bringing back clean water, by bringing back clean energy, that is something that gives you a benefit over the entire life of the plant and can fundamentally impact the ROI. The key is, does a customer believe you can do it? And, we can get into how you can make, get them to believe that or ultimately take on the risk yourself. But it's really just about the dollars and cents and whether the technology can do it efficiently.
Yeah, I want to talk about that and like who bears the risk. But maybe just to wrap out on the technology side, because we do have a lot of founders in the audience. Mike, what other areas, what gaps are you seeing in the technology? Where do you wish people were building? What pitches do you wish you heard today?
Yeah, especially around produced water, we kind of have the beginning, right, which we do for the treatment, for reuse and fracking, and as we were talking about some of the other oil field uses. We do have the end stage technologies with ZLD and some of that. So really it's the middle part of that, things like OARO or similar technologies that can let us concentrate up that brine to put it into more of a ZLD technology as well. And then obviously, the best way to extract those minerals. And, how do you do it? Do you do it in batches? Do you do it by type? And not only that, how do you do it with using the least amount of water, ironically, right? So those are the kind of things that really, when I'm out and I'm looking right now, that's what I'm looking for to identify. And kind of the cool thing about the Permian Basin, though, it is a big sandbox, so you can take a lot of this stuff out there and let them break it. I mean, that's what I tell them. When we built our newest DAF units, our folded flows, I handed it to the guys. I said, here's what it's designed to do. Make sure it can do that, and then have fun, break it. And they did it. They love doing that. But that teaches you a lot, too. So that's really what you look for when you're looking for that tech.
Clayton, same question to you. What technology do you wish, where do you see gaps? What new technology do you wish you were getting pitched?
Just hearing Mike talking about if one of our portfolio companies built something and sent it out to the field and said, go break it, that would stress me out. So, different size of companies we're discussing.
I was going to say, we can't do that with our pharma customers.
Different
I said the
mentalities.
Permian.
I'm so focused on that. Look, we get 300 to 400 water startups a year pitching to us. So we see a lot of good tech. We see a lot of really good, interesting startups. So I find the technology is not the gap from a lot of these things. It's out there for us. As I mentioned, the TRL level makes a big difference. So there's a good idea, but it's too early. Again, I kind of get back to, I love hearing from companies that have all the other aspects of their business plan thought out, right? Good team, good go-to-market, customer pain points, network, ability, and having that focus. I mean, the one thing that I would like to see, and it's a bit contradictory because, we're looking at companies that are relatively small and looking at one bit of the process, one tech, one application. I like to have them focused. Justine mentioned that earlier, but kind of having that end-to-end reuse stack from sensing, monitoring into a compliance angle, I think would be really interesting because Mike's talked about it. There's so many different treatment steps depending on the feed quality and the cleanliness, how clean is clean, to get it there. But there's a lot of different vendors in there, and there's a lot of different individual vendors, players trying to make that happen. And so having kind of one holistic monitoring, control loop, compliance tech, I would love to see. But again, that's out of scope really for us. So it's a bit contradictory, I know, but I find that overarching piece to be missing in a lot of these applications.
All right, so let's shift gears and talk about the business model. But also just a heads up that we are going to save time at the end for questions. So I encourage you to start thinking now about what questions I haven't asked and really what I'm missing and y'all want to be asking, because we'll definitely open up the floor to that. So tell me about your transformation of your pivot in the business from selling the assets to water as a service.
Yeah, I kind of touched on it before, so I'll try to be brief. But high level, it was really just about realizing the maximum value in the business and in the technology. And I think, to some extent, necessity is the mother of invention. And a number of customers that we were selling to, we were trying to convince them of the ROI case, to your early question. And we found that they were discounting the future benefits a little more than we would like. And so at a certain point in time, we just said, well, what if we just take the risk ourselves and we'll charge you by the gallon, and that price per gallon will reflect what we think we can do with this. And it really was a big unlock. And I'll be honest, some of it was influenced by folks I knew that I'd spoken with in the solar world, who articulated this value prop under the PPAs, and it really did usher in, I believe, a huge benefit. There was kind of a hidden benefit to that as well, which was that in our world, we were generating energy and biogas and combined heat and power, and we could claim credits and RECs and ITCs and things that would actually drive the cost of capital down, and none of our customers were experts in that. And so kind of wrapping that all into something we did, we took the benefit of the credits, we actually drove down the capital ourselves, and then took the risk, ended up being very helpful. I think the broader point, are you guys familiar with the book Natural Capitalism, Amory Levin's? It's it was written around 2000, and they do talk about, part of our vision at Cambrian was industrial ecology or the circular economy, and trying to help bring that about. And to do that, you really need companies focusing on their knitting, focusing on their core business. And we were selling to an Anheuser-Busch, and they would love to get clean water from their wastewater, but they don't really have time because they're making more Bud Light. And so part of that service model is about letting them focus on their core business and, letting us do what we do.
And how did that change? I guess maybe this is a question for Clayton as an investor. How would that change how you evaluate that startup? Assume, early stage, and those two different business models.
Yeah, we see it a lot, and double-edged sword from our end. Companies that are initially quite early from our end, as I've said, going into water as a service or the BOO model, build, own, and operate, it's expensive, right? And they typically, from what we see at least, they need to do that first project. They need to stand it up from their own balance sheet, because the terms they're going to get on an initial project finance when you've never done a project before are horrible, and they can bury a startup. So they're raising venture capital more or less to stand up some equipment and that first system. So there's a lot of, and we get it because the customer, that's what they want. I mean, Matt talked about it as well, right? But so the financial bid on it is challenging for us. But I mean, on the flip side, it's easier to invest in a VC or in a VC-backed company when they're not going to spend their first X million on just equipment buy and actually company build. So I'd love to hear from Matt, where were you in the funding stage when you did that business model pivot? Did you get VC money too?
Yeah, so it was post Series B, and we did talk to Emerald Series B. They turned us down, so I feel like I can be.
I wasn't working there at the time, just for the record.
Oh shit!
No, I didn't start. No, but it was. By the way, you talk to so many people when you're raising money for any company, so it's an infinite number. We think very highly of Emerald in general, but it was after the Series B. And I'd say we were still fairly early. I mean, we were close to cash flow break even on the equipment sales, but it was clear that if we really wanted to grow with this model, we're going to need a decent amount more capital. I would actually recharacterize what you said a little bit. We found there are companies out there that provide off-balance sheet equity financing for, first, second, third in kind as a service models. There's an increasing amount of capital there. We went from those, we levered them with bank capital. And then the interesting thing is, when we would talk to the VCs of the world, they want us to be as capital efficient as possible on the equity into the company, which is great. When you talk to the infrastructure investors, they're actually looking to deploy as much capital as they can at their target return. So if you can convince a bank that you can hit that return and they can be built on top of that, it actually unlocks a whole lot of capital. So whether you want to be capital efficient or not, I think depends on kind of what kind of investor you have. And that was definitely one of our lessons as we built the company, is getting alignment of the capital with the business model is like one of the most important things.
So did the investors, did the VCs that were in your early rounds re-up later?
They did. I mean, we raised from everybody, and then when we acquired that company, Basswood, we ended up inheriting 70 investors. So before we sold the company, we had the messiest capital stack you will ever believe. And that was part of the impetus, was just cleaning it up. to be honest with you, and getting it simplified and getting the financing kind of on our balance sheet and not off our balance sheet, which was adding a lot of complexity to the business. Yeah, they re-upped and then, obviously exited when we sold it.
And you sold the company in 2022?
2023.
23 to PE.
Yeah, to a real asset infrastructure investor.
Did that have to do with the size of the company and the need for that kind of capital, or were you just tired and wanted to do the hot new thing in water, which is critical minerals recovery?
Right. Yeah. We weren't thinking about critical minerals at the time, but no, it was just the right time. I mean, it was 12 years in. There were some people who had been in there for a long time that needed to get liquidity, and there were different kinds of capital in the business that weren't all aligned to the mission, and it was a good time to look for an exit given the amount of capital out there looking to scale, IP-enabled infrastructure businesses.
Clayton, is PE the logical acquirer for many of these businesses? I know some of your later portfolio companies have sold to strategics.
Not always natural. We typically look at that crossover when PE gets interested to being EBITDA positive, which a lot of our companies, we're never investing when they are. So it depends on the scale. The M&A market in water is continuing to thrive. PE continues to do a lot of roll-ups. There's a lot of big acquisitions. Last year alone, I think there were $6 or $7 billion plus acquisitions in water. Xylem's active, Veolia, et cetera. So most of our initial view on exits ends up being to strategics like these guys, right? Where when these companies start to grow. But if our companies grow to that threshold where you're double-digit millions, good growth projectile, EBITDA positive, then PEs start to get interested. It really depends on the PE group, right? Some are looking earlier, some are looking later, but there's so many different PEs rolling up bolt-ons, a lot of companies right now. It's continually active, I would say, for a lot of our companies.
And thank you for that, by the way. We appreciate the companies.
We're a natural food chain up here.
Well, Mike, when do you get interested? Or actually, I guess you want to get in as early, when do you lose interest?
Well, so Xylem, we are the largest water company in the world. So we'll get in at just about any stage. There's not one sweet spot for us. Amanda is with Early Tech, and, she helps with that part of things from academia onwards, and then we go all the way to the top, right? There's been some. I came from Evoqua when Xylem bought Evoqua, and that was a massive buy at the time, right? 2.6, I think, billion was the closing cost on that. So Xylem will step in just about any time it makes sense for the company, just like any other large public company will do.
Okay, let's do a time check. Not only because of this panel, but also I have the parking meter and my parking just I'm gonna have to read
Priorities.
But right on time, we are well on schedule, so be happy for us. I did want to open this up to the audience and then some final comments from the panel. But questions? Go ahead.
Well, so in the produced water realm, the idea of concentrating the water to reduce its volume seems to be popular. What volume reduction percentage-wise would be required to meet the capacity for deep well injection in the Permian Basin? Do we have rough estimates based on capacity for injection? And how does the concentration of those waters change the calculus for critical mineral recovery?
That is a really good question, and one I wish I had the answer to, because that would help me with a lot of math. But anything helps at this point. I would say that probably 40% reduction is where you need to be to begin with. Around the critical mineral recovery, that gets a little tougher, and that's one of the conversations. So when we were talking about lithium and lithium recovery, a lot of people out there will say, well, you need at least 400 parts per million to be, profitable to recover from produced water. Well, okay, that's halfway true. That's what you need with the technology we have right now. So as you can concentrate up, obviously that changes the equation. So if we could get all that data and if it were very easily available, that would really help, frankly, to answer that question.
We have another question up there.
Thanks. Sorry. So this is a non-scientific question, more of a business model. So it seems like there's a need, there's a demand, there's a market intersection that can move demand forward. There's technology there. From what I think I heard, there is a capital stack, even with early stage, because that's the critical problem, but there are third-party off-balance sheet folks who will invest. I was gonna ask, how do we de-risk early stage projects, but maybe that's been answered. What's standing in the way of growth, I would say, right now?
Who's that aimed at?
Yeah?
Yeah.
So what's standing in the way of
Of
industrial reuse growth, or just?
yes, I apologize.
There's a lot more growth that we've seen in the last couple of years than I've seen in the last 15, right? Depending on the market, right? You look at semiconductor fabs, right? Taiwan Semi in their plant in Arizona, they're doing 65% water reuse of that fab. Their new one that they're building is going to be 90%. That's come because they're building in a water scarce area, and these are markets with massive budgets and a requirement for consistent water in their treatment schemes. And so it's starting to happen. But in the Permian, in mining, in a bunch of the big industries, it's still looked as water's still cheap, right? And wastewater, to truck it off site, is still cheap as well for them. But like I said, I mean, we're starting to see much more adoption, from my perspective at least, in a variety of different industries, because it's no longer an ESG play, right? It's an economic cost on their balance sheet that's leading to disrupted operations. And so there is a hyper focus on water, wastewater for industries across the globe right now. It's just the pace at which they're adopting. Some are faster, some are slower. But it honestly feels like a bit of an inflection point started maybe a year ago. That's going to take another number of years.
Yeah, and actually, I'll add on to that, because I'm sorry I didn't get your question at the beginning. But, the other thing is, it does go back to that same question, how clean is clean enough? That's not just for produced water. And some things that we see is that there's a lot of these guys that worry about, if they recycle water from their plant and then take it back and put it through their process equipment, is it really clean enough for my process equipment? And they're worried that it might actually mess up their process equipment, so they don't necessarily want to, use it. So changing that attitude as well, and being able to prove, and that's where tech comes in, right? When you have the right tech and sensors, and you can prove that, hey, this water is in fact clean enough in real time, that changes attitudes.
Yeah, it's a good question. I just want to give a two-part answer. So the first is that, there's an expression, when the well is dry, you know the worth of water, right? Everybody's heard that expression. There's a tragedy of the commons problem in water, and that's solved basically via regulation. And that's the short answer is it's the enforcement of the regulation on the wastewater side generates demand. And on the clean water side, there's actually enormous uncertainty as to the guidelines under which you can actually safely recycle water across industry. And I give you lots of examples about that, but it's all regulated by different folks. Beer is regulated under the Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms for some reason. FDA regulates a bunch of the rest. And so there's no united standard for what reuse quality is safe. And that makes a lot of quality managers in these big industrial companies really nervous. And that's another huge break on it. But at the end of the day, I think Mike said something that was really important, which is, if you can make more oil and gas by reusing water, people are going to buy the technology. And so when you can improve the top line, there's a lot more demand, and that happens when the water tables drop and people see the writing on the wall.
And the complexity is more balkanized than the electrical grid.
Oh, for sure, 100%, 100%.
Thank you.
I think this point on regulation is interesting too, because as Climate Haven, we're always worried about founders that are just completely dependent on the tailwinds of the regulatory environment to drive adoption, right? Like, we've seen why that isn't a good thing to do. But it's almost like there's different kinds of regulation also, because the necessity, the inevitability of there not being any, like in produced water, for example, there's nowhere for it to go. And the earthquakes that people are seeing, the threats to people, I read about like the the wells that are receiving the pressurized water are then shooting up into people's homes and stuff. Those are not risks that you can overlook. It's not, honestly, it's not climate change, which for many people is many years down the road and not something we need to worry about today. This is like an urgent, critical, and timely problem that's driving regulation in red states. And therefore, I think it will impact adoption in a much faster and different caliber kind of way than when we generally talk about regulatory tailwinds.
Yeah, and it's a cautionary tale for other places that aren't even in the U.S., right? They see what's happening, and they see these zombie wells, they see the earthquakes, and where they've been pumping water downhole as well, all of a sudden they're looking at other ways to use it. And on the regulation front, too, if you look at other areas like Argentina and the oil and gas out of there, well, to export to the EU, they have to have the green passport, right? They have to meet certain ESG regulations also. So that also helps to drive that recycle and reuse of water additionally.
Yeah, so the U.S. is a cautionary tale for many reasons. Question.
All right. So Clayton, my question is kind of targeted at you. You keep mentioning that we have the tech. And I respectfully disagree that we have the tech. And I think that goes to Michael's comment that what is clean enough? And so I say that by asking the question, do we have tech that's good enough for right now to get to certain areas? Because some regulation is dependent on what tech is available. What is the cost of that tech to run that tech, and how reliable is it? And I'm curious about that, because by saying that we have the tech, it almost says like we don't need to look for new solutions. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. And the tech is there at varying stages of, the tech is not there commercially.
Yeah.
The tech is there in a lab. ZLD, Mike talked about, right? Getting down to ZLD quality water to beneficially reuse produced water in a data center works in the lab currently. Maybe works, right? There is liquid to liquid solvent extractions. There's multiple different process chains that you can stitch together to see that TDS down to very, very clean levels. But right now, it's most likely cost prohibitive to get it to scale. And I mean, there's also talking about permits regulation of getting it clean enough, and what does that look like for a purchase agreement into a hyperscaler. So I should have had a caveat around the tech exists at varying stages of TRLs where it has yet to get scaled up to a cost-effective and regulatory approved tech that can really make reuse standardized, if you will, across a variety of different industries.
But I do want to add, I agree with all of that. I do want to add one thing, which is a lot of the customers we'd sell to, their plants are producing $500 million to $1 billion worth of product a year, and it's going to cost them 1 to 2 to 3% of that to use our technology. So the question is, why don't they do it, right? And they don't do it because they're not. Quite often, they don't have a need. Water is very cheap. If the price is rising, that creates a mild amount of impetus. But at the end of the day, if they're going to shave 0.5% off their bottom line costs, it doesn't create a very strong momentum. And that has nothing to do with tech, right? You could invent the best tech and cut that cost in half, and you're down to 1.5% versus 3%. So that's just part of an answer.
I think that's why we haven't seen until recently a lot of growth in the water tech space, because there hasn't been as much driver. The driver hasn't been there until the last 5 years or so, I would say.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of companies that we've seen for the last 10 years floating around TRL 3, 4, 5 kind of R&D purgatory because they can't get a pilot, or they can get maybe a small scale pilot or a field demonstration, but getting to scale, for all the reasons we've talked about, the lack of regulatory drive is still there. But the tech exists. It's just cost, push, etc.
Yeah, my question's to Matt. So it's really interesting to see the trajectory of Cambrian from spinning out from a lab and all the technology and business pivots that you've had to do, and also successfully exiting. Congratulations. For the early stage innovators in the room, I have 2 questions. What was your how was it like getting your first customer or your first 5 customers? What is the pitch, and how did you actually get them on board? And the second, how did you think about, really productizing what you were doing, right? That's what we hear a lot, right? Like you need to, for it to be VC backable, it needs to be tried and tested, and it needs to be repeatable and a product. So how did you think about
Yeah, with the caveat that it's so different depending on the type of technology you're developing. So we're trying to commercialize a core process, right? Something that takes polluted water and converts it to energy and clean water in a fundamentally different way. So that came with a whole host of challenges. If I were a founder today looking at, there's a whole huge number of other kinds of it. You can develop a new membrane, you can develop a new software platform. There's so many different things that you can do, and how that first customer works and all that, it's going to vary based on that. So that's my caveat. But for us, I touched on it earlier. We did a pilot with a company called Clos du Bois Winery, and it was in Sonoma, and so again, so I literally read an article by these guys who piloted something at their facility. Okay, and it was published. So I knew that then they were folks that were interested in piloting. That gave a signal, right? Spoke with the operations manager, and we simply had a good conversation, and he became sort of intrigued. And as with a lot of things, a lot is based on relationships, and quite honestly, a lot's based on emotion. So you've got something that you're trying to do, and you have somebody who can help you do it, and it might help them a little bit, and that's the evangelical sale. It's not about the ROI. It's about like, what if all of your wastewater were fuel? That kind of discussion. Not like, hey, I can save 1% on your bottom line cost. Like, that's not how you're going to get your first sale. They're going to be like, I'm going to go to Xylem. Thanks.
Yes.
Hi, Sheikh. I'm a partner at MedSmat. We worked with your company for a long time.
Yes, very, very good
just
firm.
on the tech question, I come from this project finance perspective. Like, here's low-hanging fruit. Tech is absolutely there, and for the life of me, for the past 10 years, I can't figure out why we don't have more of this. Why isn't there one or more businesses simply putting anaerobic digesters aimed at municipal wastewater plants, simply clean up their water and produce power or fertilizers or any number of products? It seems very simple. It's definitely bankable, and yet for some reason that hasn't been done. Is it because of your point earlier, which is maybe the regulations have not, particularly under the last, this administration, come down hard enough on these, wastewater treatment plants, and it's a ticking time bomb with PFAS claims and all that, or is it something else? It just seems to be the easiest sort of low-hanging fruit out there.
Yeah, so I'm curious your answer as well, but very quickly, it is straightforward. But first of all, municipal plants are notoriously hard to sell to, and takes a very, very long time to sort of get involved. Your PFAS question is spot on. Who's going to take the risk if you've got something going through on the output from a regulatory perspective and from a compliance and risk perspective? So there's all sorts of massive downside risks that everybody's looking at and saying, we could do this, we can make a little money, but here are all the things that could go wrong. And so that slows things down. That said, there are a lot of companies that are doing that and that have tried to do that. There's also a lot of companies that have tried to do that and found it was more complex than they thought. And so investors have become a little gun shy.
Technically more complex?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, so the municipal digesters, you can generate gas, but if you're trying to do something more than that, trying to generate RNG or some other value add or all those things, there's some hesitancy. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars invested in those kinds of plants, and when they fail, it's a lot of money lost. So there still is a little work to do on reliability, I would argue.
Yeah, and excuse me, one other point to add to that. Utilities, most 90% of them aren't mandated to make money, right? It's ratepayers. So even if you're partnering with a utility to produce biogas, I'm curious, arm initially went up, right? Other than like the DC Waters of the world, we've talked with many about certain investments that would look like that, producing biogas fertilizer, being able to sell it. They've said it's, if it helps our process internally, that's great, but we're not here. We have no mandate internally to make more money, so it's not that economic piece isn't beneficial to most utilities unless, firsthand. Jeff, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's pressure on utilities to keep their rates low, though, right? So if we look at a good example of this is Greater Lawrence Sanitary District in Massachusetts. They have an on-site digester, but they also take in food waste to boost their biogas production and septage to boost their biogas production. And they save $3 million a year in electricity costs because they generate their entire electricity requirement on site and they now kick back to the grid. So that's a huge cost savings, which keeps their rates low. And so while they could be reliant on ratepayers, there's a lot of pressure, particularly on utility ratepayers now in New England, all over New England for power, wastewater, and water, that those kind of things are being more considered.
But think about who approves it at the municipality.
It was a bond, right?
Yeah, no, but who approves the installation of the system to save the $3 million?
Probably the operator or the director of the facility.
So it's usually like the city council, and the operator of the facility needs to push that to the city council. If he's getting his budget every year that's covering his numbers, there's not a huge amount of motivation for him to change. Some are getting pressure, but I would argue that there's a lot of conservativeness. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's just selling to utilities, as Matt mentioned, is painful, and it's just historically has been an area that's resistant to change, period. I mean, certain pockets excluding that, I agree, and I mean, interesting data point, I didn't realize that, but for the most part, it's everything we've talked about that we've seen a lot of companies initially striving for that, but a lot of challenges in the installation, the budget approval, the rate paying, et cetera. Sorry, I think there was one more. Yeah.
Just a comment, well, a question on that is on the water utilities and going back to the data center part, right? That there's a lot of at least talk from these hyperscalers about using recycled or reclaimed water to cool their data centers, and they have like all these sorts of commitments around it, and public facing also commitments around infrastructure and water and energy and all these pieces. And that's kind of recent because they started having much more opposition to using fresh water to cool data centers and opposition from communities. So my question is, do you see this starting to play out, that there's now this money that is willing to, hey, there's no reclaimed water available for where we are and we really want to use it, otherwise we are not being allowed to because the community doesn't want us there. Do you really think that's going to be like a driving force for more adoption, specifically on the water utility scale, or even, as you were saying, for the produced water, that maybe geographically they are separate, but how are you thinking about that?
Oh, absolutely. There's already been several data centers that have been put on hold for community pushback. And so, yeah, absolutely. That will be a massive driver. You even looking, I say I'm from Georgia, right? We look up, water comes from the sky. It's a great place to be. But at the same time, the data centers are using a whole lot of water. And there are towns and municipalities running out of the water. And you got to have data centers, so we know that's coming, right? So I absolutely think that pushback is going to be a huge driver. I don't think it's there yet, because right now they can just pick up and say, okay, we're going to go over here. But that'll come to an end before too long, too, in my opinion.
Great. Well, thank you for this. I want to thank Aish in particular for bringing together this group and introducing me to